Hello, my name is Barry Spearing, and I'm the lead physiologist in the Sport Research Lab at New Balance Athletics. And this is a presentation entitled Training for Human Performance from Soldiers to Spaceflight. Before I dive into the presentation, I just wanted to give you a little bit of context. This is a presentation that I gave at the Spaceflight Human Optimization and Performance Conference in April of 2023 in Houston, Texas. A little bit of more context. So the reason why the conference organizers asked me to give this presentation is a few years ago, I had the honor of working in the Military Performance Division at the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine, also known as USAREM, and our mission was to protect the health and performance of soldiers. And about a decade before that, I had the honor of working at NASA Johnson Space Center inside the Exercise Physiology and Countermeasures Lab, where our mission, of course, was to protect the health and performance of astronauts. So the conference organizers asked me to give this presentation and talk a little bit about my insights with respect to research for soldier health and performance, and talk about that, how that might translate to protecting astronaut health and performance. Before I move on too much further, I just wanted to share a few acknowledgments. First, this presentation focuses on insights gained from a couple of recent review articles that I had the honor of writing with some fantastic co-authors. So I just wanted to acknowledge the contributions of my co-authors. First of all, Brian Clark from Ohio University, also Brad Schoenfeld from Lehman College, and then from USAREM, I had the opportunity to work with Stefan Pasiakos, Steve Follis, and Marilyn Sharp. And then finally, from the University of the Basque Country, I had the opportunity to collaborate with Inigo Mujica. While I worked on these review articles, I was funded by an appointment to USAREM administered by the Oak Ridge Institute of Science and Education, and also Brian Clark was supported by the NIH. And then lastly, the opinions that I share in this presentation are purely my own based on the scientific literature. They don't reflect any official government policy. And then also Brad Schoenfeld serves on the Scientific Advisory Board of Tonal, who's a manufacturer of exercise equipment. All right, so now to jump in, the first part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about keys for maximizing strength in soldiers. And as I think you'll appreciate, this also has a lot of relevance for astronauts. And the bulk of this chapter of the presentation will come from a recent review article that I published earlier this year. The second chapter of the presentation is focusing on keys for maintaining endurance in soldiers. And most of those insights will come from a paper that my co-authors and I published in 2021. And then lastly, I want to discuss whether these keys are in fact effective in spaceflight. So in other words, in chapter 1, I'm going to talk about keys for maximizing strength in soldiers. Chapter 2, I'll talk about keys for maintaining endurance in soldiers. But then the real question is, are these two keys really effective in spaceflight for astronauts? And to do that, I'm going to compare my recommendations with real data published by NASA scientists led by Dr. Scott and published earlier this year. So first, I am sure a lot of you will appreciate strength training is very potent for improving soldier performance. If you talk about the actual tasks that it improves, well, one task that soldiers frequently have to do is carry really heavy loads or backpacks for long distances, and strength training does in fact improve soldiers' ability to perform this task, how fast they perform it, how long they can perform it. Strength training also improves soldiers' abilities to perform emergency tasks. So one task that soldiers have to be able to complete is to perform what's called a casualty evacuation. So if one of their comrades got injured on the battlefield, they have to be able to evacuate that casualty. And lo and behold, strength training improves their ability to perform that task quickly. Also, not surprising, soldiers frequently have to lift heavy objects as part of their job. And then what might also be a little bit surprising is strength training also improves endurance. So strength training improves this attribute called running economy. And running economy for the human body is just like fuel economy for your car. So if it takes you less energy to run, then you can run further and faster on the same tank of gas. And surprisingly, strength training does improve running economy, therefore strength training can improve endurance. So if strength training is so potent for improving soldier performance, the question that we asked in this review paper published in 2023 is, how do we push the upper limits of strength gains? In other words, how do we provide soldiers with interventions that maximize their gains in strength? So our goal for this review paper was, in soldiers, how do we maximize their strength beyond current upper limits? And as I think you could probably appreciate, we could easily change this question to, in astronauts, how do we maintain strength during spaceflight? So there's a lot of similarity between these two questions. But regardless of whether the question is, how do we maximize strength in soldiers, or how do we maintain strength in astronauts, that question is really just the tip of the iceberg. The real question that we need to answer is, what stimulates strength gains in the first place? If we understand what makes people stronger, then this opens up a whole broad array of potential interventions to increase strength beyond just traditional resistance exercise. So we're going to spend a lot of this presentation talking about what actually stimulates strength gains. So like I said in our review article in 2023, we asked the question, what stimulates strength gains? And really what my co-authors and I found was, if you break down a muscle contraction, you find that there are really 5 important steps to a muscle contraction, and each of those steps is really important for stimulating strength gains. So in this slide, I'm just going to provide a high-level overview of those 5 steps, and in the remaining slides, I'll dive into them a little bit more deeply. So the first important part is whenever you lift a weight, you make a conscious decision to give maximal mental effort. And what I'm going to show you in the next slide is giving maximal mental effort is actually really important for maximizing your strength gains. Then, once in a traditional exercise, when you give maximal mental effort, that usually leads to a forceful muscle contraction. And I'm going to provide some evidence to show that that is really important for stimulating strength gains. Also, the next step is when you give a forceful muscle contraction, that usually involves lifting the weight as well as lowering the weight. And I'll talk about its role in stimulating strength gains. Usually you train through a full range of motion. And then finally, if you perform that muscle contraction multiple times, so back to back to back, so like a set of 10 repetitions, over time, those muscle contractions cause metabolic stress inside the muscle. And that metabolic stress might be really important for telling your muscle to get bigger and stronger. Now you'll note for step 5, I put a little asterisk at the end, and that's because the jury's still a little out as to whether metabolic stress causes gains in muscle size. But I think there's some compelling emerging evidence to say that it might have a role. It's just not conclusive yet. So I put an asterisk next to number 5, whereas steps 1 through 4, they seem pretty conclusive based on the available evidence. So first, let's talk a little bit about giving maximal mental effort and why that's important for maximizing your strength gains. So I'll start with an insight that you might already know. And the insight is that your brain adapts to strength training just as much as your muscles. Another way of saying that is your brain is in command of your muscles. Your brain tells your muscles what to do. And part of the reason why you get stronger is that your brain is able to send a stronger signal to your muscle to tell your muscle to more fully contract. And so there's plenty of evidence out in the scientific literature to support the concept that yes, indeed, the brain does adapt to strength training. But now here's a really important question. If the brain adapts to strength training, and I think there's evidence to say that it does, then what tells the brain to adapt to strength training? And if you think about it, that's kind of a curious question, because we usually think about muscles and how muscle contractions can cause muscles to get bigger and stronger. But what tells the brain to get stronger? Well, the answer is the mental effort associated with strength training. In other words, when you make a conscious decision to give maximal mental effort, that activates certain neural pathways inside the muscle. And over time, those neural pathways are able to send a stronger signal to the muscle, and the muscle is able to perform a stronger muscle contraction. Now, if that's true, and again, the evidence suggests that it is true, then the implication is you can tell your brain to get stronger without actually moving a muscle or even turning on a muscle contraction. And this is called motor imagery training. Another way of saying that is if you measure your brain activity while you perform a muscle contraction, and you measure your brain activity while you're imagining and mentally straining to perform a muscle contraction without actually moving a muscle, that mental activity, that electrical activity in the brain is pretty much the same. And this research by Perovlich et al. Shows that mentally performing the strength training is very potent for stimulating strength gains, even if you don't activate or even move a muscle. So I'll talk about this a little bit more, just to provide a little bit of evidence, just to show how powerful this is. This is a title from a scientific publication, and I feel like the title says it all. It says, "From mental power to muscle power, gaining strength by using the mind." So these researchers had a really clever design. They took 3 groups of participants and they had them perform training for 12 weeks. One group did nothing, so they just measured their strength at the beginning of the study, measured their strength 12 weeks later, and not surprising, they had essentially no change in muscle strength. Then they took a second group, and they were what we would call like a traditional strength training group, where they performed muscle contractions, intense muscle contractions, 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And after 12 weeks of doing that, their strength increased 53%. And now here's where it gets really exciting. They took a third group and they had them perform motor imagery training. So in other words, they mentally performed the resistance exercise. They mentally strained to perform the resistance exercise, but they weren't allowed to activate their muscles. So in other words, all the strength training really just occurred inside their mind. And what they found was after 12 weeks of doing that, their strength improved about 35%. So key caveat is these are novice strength trainers. So if you took a professional strength trainer and you had them perform motor imagery, they probably wouldn't improve their strength much over time. But if you take people that are totally novice, then this evidence shows that performing mental motor imagery training or giving maximal mental effort is pretty potent for increasing strength. I want to add one last caveat is I'm talking purely about strength, and I'm not talking about other health applications. So if you're going to send an astronaut into space, motor imagery might be really effective for maintaining their strength, but it might not be so effective for other health benefits like maintaining bone mass or help regulating blood glucose or regulating blood pressure or anything like that. But when it comes to performance, specifically strength, motor imagery training is very effective. And so the bottom line is that motor imagery training, in other words, giving maximal mental effort without actually moving a muscle, can increase strength in novice people. So just to summarize, imagined muscle contractions increase strength. So I've talked about that in detail the last couple of slides. One thing that I won't talk about a lot is there's also evidence to show that greater mental effort produces greater strength gains. In other words, if you mentally perform a maximal muscle contraction and you compare that to a second group that mentally performs a muscle contraction at like 20% of effort, the group that gives 100% effort gets greater strength gains over time than the group that gives 20% effort. And so to summarize all that, I say that maximal mental effort independently and progressively stimulates strength gains. Independently means mental effort without any muscle contraction increases strength, and then progressively means greater mental effort produces greater strength gains over time. All right, shifting gears a little bit. In the weight room, when you give maximal mental effort, that leads to a forceful muscle contraction, and there's evidence to support that. First, if you electrically stimulate a muscle contraction day after day after day, that can increase the size and strength of the muscle over time, over several weeks. In other words, if you completely bypass the brain and you stimulate your muscle with an electrical stimulator, so it takes zero mental effort, you will still get a little bit bigger and stronger muscles. And another piece of evidence is that more forceful muscle contractions produce greater strength gains over time. In other words, muscle contractions that require or that are involved with lifting heavier loads produce greater strength gains than lifting lighter loads. So all that leads to the conclusion that muscle contractions independently and progressively improve strength. So again, independently means you can bypass the brain, stimulate the muscle contractions through an electrical stimulus that will improve strength. And then also progressively means the more force you generate in your muscles, the greater the strength gains over time. All right, now in the gym, maximal mental effort leads to a forceful muscle contraction, and forceful muscle contractions typically involve lifting as well as lowering the weight. And the evidence to support that both of these are important, there was a study funded by NASA back in the 90s led by Dr. Gary Dudley, and he took groups of participants and had them train for several weeks. The group on the far right did your traditional resistance exercise, so they lifted and lowered the weight. And then they had a group that just lifted the weight. And then the investigators would lower it for them, and then the subjects would lift it again. And really, they were trying to answer the question, is the lowering the weight an important part of stimulating strength gains? Well, what they found was the group that only lifted the weight, they got a little bit stronger. But the group that lifted and lowered the weight, they doubled their improvements in strength. And to me, what this says is, if you want to develop an exercise device up in space, you should probably develop an exercise device that involves lowering motions just as much as it involves lifting motions. Now, one key caveat that the investigators asked is, hey, you know what? The group that lifted and lowered the weight, they did, twice the amount of exercise as the group that only lifted the weight. So what happens if we take another group and we'll have them still only lift the weight, but they'll double the amount of exercise to kind of make it more similar to the group that lifted and lowered? And what they found was, yeah, doubling the amount of lifting improved your strength gains compared to the group on the far left, but lifting and lowering still outperformed the lifting only. So again, if you're going to develop an exercise device for spaceflight, to me, this evidence says that you should lift and lower the weight. So my conclusion is that strength gains following lifting plus lowering training are greater than strength gains following lifting only training. Usually when you involve lifting and lowering movements, that usually involves training through a full range of motion. And so there's some evidence to support that. So I'm going to conceptualize this using isokinetic data. So isokinetic data, that's just a fancy strength measurement device that will constantly measure your force output throughout the entire range of motion. And if we take an exercise kind of like the bicep curl, usually you get a curve that looks like this. So you can produce some force at the beginning range of motion, but you can perform even more force at the middle of that range of motion, and then slightly less force again at the end of the range of motion. And then if you are going to train for several weeks, but just at the beginning of the range of motion, well, you're going to get stronger, but mostly just at the beginning of the range of motion. Your strength gains are specific to the range of motion that you use for training. However, if you train with a full range of motion, then you get stronger throughout the range of motion. You get stronger at the beginning, middle, and end of that range of motion. So my conclusion is that training with a full range of motion typically maximizes strength gains across multiple joint angles. So if you're going to train up in spaceflight, you should train probably through a full range of motion. All right, lastly, for this section, I'm going to provide some evidence that causing muscular metabolic stress also stimulates gains in muscle size and strength. So there's some evidence to support this. It's not entirely conclusive, but as you'll see in the picture, in the last 15 years or so, there's been a huge increase in the amount of research that has looked at blood flow restriction exercise. In other words, they take this device that kind of looks like a blood pressure cuff, and they restrict the blood flow to your muscle while you're performing exercises. And what they find is, if you compare three groups of people, so one group that trains with a very light load, one group that trains with the same light load, but they involve blood flow restriction, or BFR, and then a third group that just does traditional heavy load exercise. Then you look at their strength gains after several weeks of training. You get something that looks like this. So the low load group, yeah, they'll get stronger, but the low load group with blood flow restriction gets even greater strength gains, which to me suggests something's happening with blood flow restriction that's causing your muscles to get even bigger and even stronger. And to me, that means it's maybe the muscular metabolic stress that's sending a signal to make your muscle bigger. And then finally, if you compare this group to the group that performs traditional heavy load exercise, some studies show that heavy load exercise is better than low load plus blood flow restriction, but some studies show that heavy load exercise and low load plus blood flow restriction are pretty similar and not that different. So again, this is just all to illustrate the point that blood flow restriction can help amplify your strength training adaptations. So to summarize, blood flow restriction, or BFR, during low load resistance exercise, which I'll abbreviate RE, enhances strength gains compared to low load only. And then another piece of evidence is studies that use blood flow restriction without any muscle contractions. In other words, they take people who have undergone surgery, so like an ACL surgery, and if you've had surgery, you can't activate your muscles because you're trying to recover from that injury. Well, they'll use those blood pressure cuffs to restrict blood flow to the muscle, 5 sets of 5 minutes each with 5 minutes of rest in between. And what they find is if you do this blood flow restriction over time, that'll help preserve the size and strength of muscles. So again, to me, this kind of suggests that causing metabolic stress inside the muscle helps stimulate muscle growth and improvements in muscle strength. All right, so that's a lot of information, and I want to try to put it all together into one figure to try to illustrate my main points. So when you look at the dose response of your typical daily training load, ranging from 0% of 1 rep max, which means you're not using any weight at all, compared to 100% of 1 rep max, you're lifting the heaviest weight you could possibly lift. And then you plot that as a function of your long-term gains in strength. If you lift heavy loads, you get your biggest gains in strength. To summarize, if I was going to rank the effectiveness of resistance exercise interventions for improving strength, lifting heavy loads with maximal mental effort maximizes your gains in strength. However, you can also choose to lift a lighter load, but still use maximal mental effort. In other words, you could do explosive plyometric exercises, or you could choose a lighter load and then just lift and lift and lift until you can't lift anymore and your effort becomes maximal. You'll still get stronger. You might not get as strong as lifting heavy weights, but you will get stronger. And then finally, if you do motor imagery training, in other words, you give maximal mental effort, but you don't even move a muscle or lift any load at all, you still will get a little stronger over time. It's not as effective as actually lifting a weight, but when you can't move a muscle or you're up in space and there's no access to exercise equipment, motor imagery training might be effective. And then I added another curve, and this is just a hypothesis, but as I showed in the previous slide, there's some good evidence to show that if you combine blood flow restriction to light load resistance exercise, you will get a bigger gain in strength than performing just low load resistance exercise. I have not seen any research that combines blood flow restriction plus motor imagery training, but my guess is it would be an additive effect since they work through two totally different mechanisms. So blood flow restriction works via stimulating metabolic stress inside your muscle, whereas motor imagery training works by telling your brain to get stronger. And then lastly, there's a little bit of research that combines blood flow restriction plus heavy load resistance exercise. That research seems a little bit inconclusive to me, at least. So the points that I'm trying to make is adding blood flow restriction increases the effectiveness of resistance exercise, but the benefits of adding blood flow restriction might diminish as the load becomes progressively higher. All right, so to summarize, keys for maintaining strength in spaceflight or maximizing strength in soldiers, first, we need to know what stimulates strength gains. And the keys are to give maximal mental effort, to produce forceful muscle contractions, to involve lifting as well as lowering movements, to train through a full range of motion, and finally to induce some musculometabolic stress. And now that we know what stimulates strength gains, that opens up a broad array of potential interventions to help maintain and maximize strength. Those interventions include heavy resistance exercise or low load yet high effort resistance exercise like plyometrics or lifting a light weight until you can't lift it anymore. Also, there's motor imagery training. There's blood flow restriction, which can be passive, so without any muscle contractions, or it can be active, so you combine blood flow restriction with some muscle contractions. And then finally, it's also possible that electrically stimulating the muscle can improve size and strength of the muscle over time. All right, now we're moving on to chapter 2. Now we'll talk about the keys for maintaining endurance in soldiers. So first, to provide a little context, when soldiers are at their home base, the Army provides them with time and resources and recommendations for training. But when soldiers are deployed, things become a little bit more complicated. Some soldiers have very, we'll say, challenging operational tasks, and their unit's operational tempo might be very challenging. So there's just a lot of moving parts. So the Army leaves it on soldiers to take personal responsibility to manage their own training. So there's no explicit guidance. And I think that's wise. That said, there's also the possibility that without any explicit guidance, soldiers could either overtrain while they're deployed, which wouldn't be ideal, or they could undertrain while they're deployed and lose some fitness along the way. And so we ask the question, what is the least amount of exercise that soldiers need to perform to maintain their endurance? Because if you give them the least amount, that'll help maintain their performance without risking overtraining. Key caveat is the data that I'm going to show is based on earthbound subjects who are otherwise physically active, not astronauts confined to a small vessel during spaceflight. So the exact recommendations that I'm going to give in the next few slides need to be taken in the appropriate context. And then the other caveat is the data that I'm going to show you focuses exclusively on performance, so endurance, not on health. So the minimal amount of exercise to maintain performance might be different than the minimal amount of exercise needed to maintain health, like bone mineral density, insulin sensitivity, blood pressure regulation, things like that. So the first question you might ask is, hey, is maintaining aerobic fitness during deployment even a problem? Well, the short answer is, I think it is. So these are 3 studies, all led by researchers out of USAREM, and all involved deployment to either Iraq or Afghanistan, and they involved deployments of somewhere between 9 and 15 months. And as you can see, all 3 of these studies showed that on average, soldiers lost VO2 max. VO2 max is the maximal amount of oxygen that people can take in and transport and deliver to their muscles. It's a measure of aerobic fitness. It's also a measure of endurance. Again, all of these studies show that on average, soldiers are losing fitness during deployment. Now, I emphasize on average because some soldiers are absolutely maintaining their performance, but some soldiers are definitely losing performance. And so that can have some consequences. Now, what are the consequences? Well, Brad Warr from USAREM did a little research, and he split the soldiers up into 3 groups. So group 1, they actually improved their aerobic fitness during deployment. Group 2 lost a little bit of aerobic fitness during deployment, and group 3 lost a lot of aerobic fitness during deployment. And then what he did is, after he separated them into those 3 groups, he just looked into their medical records with their approval, of course, and counted the total number of medical visits that they had during deployment. And what they found was the group that lost a lot of fitness also was the group that had a lot of medical visits. In other words, losing aerobic fitness is associated with increased illness and increased injury. We can't say there's a cause and effect relationship, but there is an association. So to me, again, this supports that maintaining fitness during deployment is a problem, or it can be a problem, and it can have some implications for soldiers. So now I'm going to talk about what's the least amount of exercise that you need to maintain fitness. I'm going to use this same figure for the next few slides, so let me take a second to explain it. So everything along the horizontal axis is time in weeks. Everything in blue is the time that they spent training, and everything that's in gray is the time they spent reduced training. And then everything on the vertical axis is their performance. So in this case, endurance. And when I say endurance, I mean their ability to perform a prolonged bicycling task or a prolonged running task on a treadmill. So in this study, which is actually a compilation of 3 studies by Hickson et al. In the 1980s, they took a group of college students and their training frequency was 6 days a week. Their training volume was 40 minutes a day. And their training intensity in terms of heart rate reserve was around what they said 100%. In other words, these college students trained as hard as they possibly could for 40 minutes a day on 6 days a week. And after 10 weeks, their endurance improved about 150%, which is a big, big improvement. And then the next thing they did is they took these college students and they systematically divided them into a bunch of different groups where they changed one variable at a time to see how well that they could maintain their fitness over this period of reduced training. In one group, their training volume was reduced by 1/3. So in other words, their training frequency was still 6 days a week, but their volume, instead of being 40 minutes a day, is now 26 minutes a day. So their volume was reduced by 1/3, where their frequency and their intensity stayed the same. Now take a second to imagine, what do you think happened to their performance after 15 weeks of doing that? Well, the answer is no change. So they were able to perfectly maintain their endurance despite cutting their volume back by 1/3. Then they asked the question, all right, what happens if their volume is reduced by 2/3? So they're still training 6 days a week. They're still training at 100% of their maximal intensity, but now they're training just 13 minutes a day instead of 40 minutes a day. Now take a second to imagine, what do you think happened to their performance? And the answer is, it went down, but just a little bit. So it statistically significantly went down, but they still were able to maintain a vast majority of their training adaptations. So it looks like if you want to fully maintain endurance, you need about 26 minutes of exercise a day, or at least something more than 13 minutes. Then they asked the question, what about the effects of reduced intensity? So in this group, their intensity was reduced by 1/3. So they still trained 6 days a week, 40 minutes a day, but instead of training at 100% of their abilities, they trained at about 80% of their abilities. Now, what do you think happened to their performance? Well, it went down significantly. And just to put the nail in the coffin, we took another group and their intensity was reduced by 2/3. And now their training intensity is just 40% of their heart rate reserve. And as you can imagine, their performance went down even more. Now, mind you, they are training 6 days a week and 40 minutes a day. So if you would have given me that information, I would have guessed that they would have perfectly maintained their performance. But what this shows is just how important training intensity is for maintaining endurance. And this has, of course, implications for astronauts. So if astronauts want to maintain their endurance performance, it seems that maintaining intensity is really important. So to summarize the keys for maintaining endurance, as far as exercise volume, it seems that about 26 minutes a day seems to be the minimal dose for fully maintaining endurance, although keep in mind as little as 13 minutes a day seems quite effective. When it comes to intensity, intensity must be maintained as high as reasonably possible. As little as a 1/3 reduction in training intensity seriously compromises your endurance performance, despite the fact that you're training 6 days a week and 40 minutes a day. And then finally, just to reiterate what I said a few slides ago, these data are from otherwise active Earthbound subjects, not astronauts confined to a small vessel during spaceflight. And also these data focus on performance, not health. So just keep those caveats in mind when interpreting these findings. All right, we talked about chapter 1, we talked about chapter 2. Now let's move on to the final chapter, chapter 3. Are these keys effective in spaceflight? And again, I'm going to compare chapter 1 and chapter 2 to data published by NASA scientists led by Dr. Scott. And so here's the publication. It's called The Effects of Exercise Countermeasures on Multi-System Function in Long-Duration Spaceflight. So a very comprehensive study looking at bone function and health parameters and physical performance. But what it involved is, just to give you a little more context, when astronauts are up in spaceflight, specifically in the International Space Station, the ISS, they have access to some amazing exercise hardware. So one device is a resistance exercise device called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, and it provides up to 600 pounds of resistance, which is fantastic. They also have a second generation treadmill called T2 that can go up to about 12 miles an hour. And finally, they have a cycle ergometer called CVIS, which stands for Cycle Ergometer with Vibration Isolation System, and it can go up to 350 watts. So in other words, when astronauts are up in space, they have access to essentially world-class exercise hardware. They might not have it, they probably won't have access to this equipment if they're trying to go to Mars, but this is the best case scenario. Also, while astronauts are on the International Space Station, they have access to world-class exercise specialists and professionals who prescribe their daily exercise. So when they're up into space, they perform resistance exercise on about 3 to 6 days per week, and it's progressive, meaning the intensity increases as their abilities increase. It's also periodized, meaning that the people that prescribe the exercise structure their days so there's lots of variability and changes in volume and intensity. And when it comes to endurance exercise, they train about 5 to 6 days a week, and the intensity can be continuous exercise, like a 20-minute run on a treadmill. It can also be interval training where they run really hard for a couple minutes and rest for a couple minutes and then repeat that consecutively. So again, world-class exercise hardware, world-class exercise prescription. Excuse me. So what happens with strength? So if you're going to ask me, I would hypothesize that they would fully maintain their strength because of how great the exercise hardware is and how great the exercise prescription are. But what did they actually find? Well, they measured their upper body strength, so their bench press 1 repetition maximum. They measured their lower body strength in terms of the leg press exercise, and they measured their quadriceps cross-sectional area. And this is a measurement of muscle area or muscle volume, or how much muscle you have. Well, what did they find? Well, after 6 months of spaceflight, the astronauts definitely maintained their bench press or their upper body strength. However, unfortunately, the astronauts significantly lost lower body strength and also lower body muscle cross-sectional area. So what this says to me is world-class exercise hardware and world-class exercise prescriptions did not fully maintain lower body strength, and loss of lower body strength seems to be due to, or at least associated with, loss of muscle cross-sectional area. And this is important because in a few slides, if we know why they lost strength, then this helps us to prescribe better interventions in the future. Now, what about endurance? Well, they didn't directly measure endurance, but they did measure their maximal oxygen consumption, or their VO2 peak, which is an indirect marker of endurance. And after 6 months of spaceflight, what they found is a significant loss in VO2 peak. So my conclusion is that world-class exercise hardware and world-class exercise prescriptions did not fully maintain VO2 peak, and loss of VO2 peak implies reduced endurance performance, even though they didn't directly measure endurance performance. Again, if you would have asked me, I would have hypothesized that they fully maintained VO2 peak, but that's not what happened. So on the bright side, this gives us some opportunities for future research and is really helpful for guiding that future research. So these are just my opinions. To summarize, heavy resistance exercise mostly, but not completely, maintains muscle strength during spaceflight. And loss of strength during spaceflight seems mostly due to muscle factors, so in other words, loss of muscle size, rather than neural factors. So I didn't present this in my earlier slides, but Ajit Mulavara and colleagues from NASA showed that when astronauts went up into space, their brain's ability to activate the muscle didn't really change. But Dr. Scott's data shows their muscle volume does change. So again, this says that the loss of strength is probably because of changes at the muscle, not due to changes in the brain. And this is really important because it gives us insight as to how we prevent strength losses in the future. So knowing that strength loss is due to muscle factors, in the future, can we use supplemental muscle-specific interventions to help fully maintain strength during spaceflight in the future? One example could be a physical intervention like blood flow restriction or neuromuscular electrical stimulation. I provided some references in case you wanted to dive into this in a little bit more detail. Another opportunity is nutritional interventions. So some authors have hypothesized that an energy deficit during spaceflight contributes to the loss of muscle mass and the loss of strength. So it's possible that giving astronauts more energy might be helpful. Also, some people totally reasonably, they recommend more, or they suggest potentially taking more amino acids during spaceflight to help preserve muscle size and strength. But just bear in mind that you need to take a holistic approach. So Dr. Scott Smith and Dr. Sarah Zwart from NASA have shown, and their colleagues have shown that additional amino acids might be good for muscle, but it might be detrimental for bone, or at least it's possible. So we just need to think through all the implications whenever we prescribe a new intervention. And then lastly, it could be pharmacological. So Dr. Dillon and colleagues from NASA looked at giving people clinical doses of testosterone while they were in bed rest, and they found that those clinical levels of testosterone help to maintain muscle mass. So maybe there's an opportunity to explore this in spaceflight. Of course, that is a pharmacological intervention, so there's a lot of research that needs to be done in terms of protecting the health of astronauts as well as protecting the performance, but there is a little evidence to say that it might be helpful. Now, what about for endurance? Well, intense endurance exercise mostly, but not completely, maintains endurance during spaceflight. And now the question is, why? Why isn't endurance training 100% effective? Well, Stuart Lee and colleagues have shown that at least during bed rest, loss of endurance is strongly associated with loss of plasma volume. So in other words, plasma volume is like the liquid component of your blood. And when you go up into space, you lose plasma volume. And if you lose that plasma volume, you have less overall blood volume to pump to your muscles to help them fuel their exercise. So if it is plasma volume, then can we develop supplemental plasma volume specific interventions to help fully maintain endurance during spaceflight? One example could be physical. So Stuart Lee has shown, and his colleagues have shown, that lower body negative pressure helps to maintain plasma volume and endurance in bed rest at least. But it could also be nutritional. So there's some research in bed rest to show that giving people extra fluid and extra salt helps to maintain plasma volume. And by maintaining plasma volume, they're able to better maintain endurance. Now, my final thoughts to kind of wrap this all up. One question I have is some loss of performance during spaceflight inevitable? In other words, going into this presentation, our goal was to fully maintain muscle strength and fully maintain endurance, but maybe some loss of performance during spaceflight is just inevitable. Maybe we can't fully maintain. If that's true, then how much of a loss in performance can astronauts tolerate without jeopardizing mission success? So as an example, Jeff Ryder and colleagues have shown that once your strength to body mass ratio falls below a certain level, this impairs your ability to perform some spaceflight tasks. That's just some preliminary research. I know NASA has some great ongoing research to try to dig into this idea a little better and develop some objective physical performance standards for astronauts. Having these minimal performance standards might be really helpful as an entrance requirement, as well as provide objective performance goals during spaceflight. And then the next question is how to maintain performance during spaceflight when traditional hardware isn't available. So the data by Dr. Scott and colleagues, that was in the International Space Station, where astronauts have access to world-class exercise equipment and world-class exercise prescriptions. Well, astronauts might not have access to these things when they're going to Mars, and the space might be much more limited. So how do we develop effective exercise equipment during spaceflight? As an example, Lori Plott-Snyder and colleagues showed that in bed rest, at least, the flywheel exercise was pretty promising for maintaining physical performance, but to my knowledge, no research has specifically looked at how effective the flywheel exercise device is during spaceflight. So more work needs to be done. So to summarize my presentation, first we talked about keys for maintaining and maximizing strength. The keys are to give maximal mental effort, to produce forceful muscle contractions, to involve lifting as well as lowering movements, to train through a full range of motion, and finally to induce some muscle metabolic stress. Next, we talked about keys for maintaining endurance, and the keys are to maintain exercise intensity as high as reasonably possible, and then also to strive for somewhere in the neighborhood of about 26 minutes of exercise per day, endurance exercise. And then lastly, we asked the question, are these keys effective in real spaceflight? And the answer is mostly, but not entirely. And so perhaps there's an opportunity for targeted supplemental interventions. So for muscle, it could be nutritional interventions or physical interventions to help maintain muscle size and strength. And for endurance, it could be some plasma volume specific interventions. Also, we asked the question, can we create minimal performance standards for astronauts? So that gives them entrance requirements, but also a target to maintain while they're in space. And then finally, what's the future of exercise hardware when astronauts are confined to small spaces? So with all that being said, thank you very much for tuning in. This has been my presentation on training for human performance. If you have any questions, feel free to find me via LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time, and take care.